This is the lecture series owing up to the urban. This is the 2023 series, and we are really excited today to be welcoming Mona Fawaz. The series is hosted by the Master of Urban Design degrees at the University of Virginia and the University of Michigan. And we are Maria Arquero de Alarcón here and my colleague.
Yeah, I'm Mona Al-Kafif. Thank you, Maria. We give a short introduction today. This semester, we are specifically interested in featuring novel organizational infrastructures in which the design disciplines strategize on experimental approaches to address urban complexity and uncertainty. Often embedded in the context of academic institutions, nonprofit organizations, or larger professional firms, the lab, the center, or the cluster offer productive configurations where research and design methodologies can be experimented with, challenged, and innovated. As a part of today's presentation, we ask guest speakers to reflect on a series of questions, among them agency, method, actor, actions, funding, and the possibility for replication.
Aya, take it from here. We cannot hear you, Aya.
Thank you, Mona. Thank you, Maria. Hello, everyone. I am Aya. Please allow me first to welcome Dr. Mona Fawaz in Arabic. أهلا وسهلا فيكي دكتورة منى فواز، بيسعدنا كثير وجودك معنا اليوم، متشوقين لمحاضرة قيمة ونقاش مثمر معك في النهاية. Now, switching back to English, welcome once again, Dr. Mona. We're very happy to have you with us today, and we're looking forward to an insightful lecture and a fruitful discussion at the end. Now, introducing Dr. Mona. Mona Fawaz is a professor in urban studies and planning at the American University of Beirut, where she's also the co-founder of the Beirut Urban Lab, a regional research center invested in working towards more inclusive, just, and viable cities. Mona is also the director of the Social Justice and the City Research Program based at the Issam Faris Institute of Public Policy at AUB, and served as a fellow at the Radcliffe Institute of Advanced Studies at Harvard University. She has served on numerous national, regional, and international juries, including the Aga Khan Award in 2019.
Mona's research spans across urban history and historiography, social and spatial justice, informality and the law, land, housing, property, and space, as well as planning practice, theory, and pedagogy. She is the author of over 50 scholarly articles, book sections, and reports in Arabic, French, and English. She has also worked as a consultant advising on urban and regional development, as well as housing, land, and property issues. In addition, Mona has been tightly involved in Beirut's ongoing transformations by publishing in the local press and speaking in numerous local ventures, where she has advocated for upgrading informal settlements, protecting the urban commons, improving urban livability, adopting more inclusive planning standards, and more generally, defending the right of the city for the urban majorities.
Tamina? All right. Well, thank you so much for the invitation, Maria and Mona. And thank you, everyone, really, for this event and for this generous introduction. I'm very happy to be with you today to speak of the Beirut Urban Lab and in our experience in setting up this research hub at the American University of Beirut. So first, just a couple of words about who we are. So the Beirut Urban Lab is what we call a collaborative and interdisciplinary research center. It was established back in 2018 at the American University of Beirut. Now, that's always the first question, like, how did you get to do that? How did the center live more than 1 year? Because a lot of our colleagues start the lab and then it dies after 1 year. So the first thing to say is that we worked together for over 10 years, for something like 15 years, in pairs, in 3 or 4. before we came to the realization that we could bring our forces and really imagine ourselves establishing something towards the future. The four of us, the co-director, come from different design disciplines. My colleague Huwaida Al-Harithi is an urban historian, Ahmed Gharbi is a graphic designer, Mona Harib is in urban politics, and I am a city planner. So the fact that we come from different disciplines has meant that we started working together on different projects, collaborating first. Our first big collaboration was back in 2006 when I had just joined the faculty and there was a very big war in which the Israeli army destroyed about a quarter of Beirut's suburbs. And there was really like a very big effort to do this post-disaster recovery, and we started getting involved in different projects. Some of us were working rather in the south, others in Beirut, and we started talking together. And that kind of collaborative work over the year grew into more and more projects that that sort of tried to focus on public space, propose designs for the coast, reflect on the impact of refugees on the city. And these kinds of collaborations that we often did in pairs and not as four really became seeds in which we learned how to work together and to build the collaborative network that allowed us to finally establish the Urban Lab, which today has actually over 15 researchers, more than 10 graduate students doing their masters there. We don't have a PhD program at AUB, but we host regularly PhD students and postdocs who want to work on the city and a few interns. Just so I don't take things for granted, I always like to start by saying, well, this is where Lebanon is. So it's in the Middle East, this is the United States, and we are between Africa, Europe, and the larger Middle East. I hope I'm sharing the right presentation. Yes, sorry. So that's Beirut, and I had put in a couple of slides for the American University to show you, but I guess something was not saved in the presentation. So what I thought I'd do in the time that you've given me tonight is present two projects that really represent some of the work that I have been leading at the lab. Before I do that, I want to just explain why I chose these two projects and how I came to work on these two projects. You posed a question, which is like, so why a lab and why choose projects and how? And I think there were two very strong imperatives that for me made a lot of sense in shifting from working on my own to working as part of a collective. The first was that when you work in data scarce environments, where there's no map of the city, when there's no information you actually can access, you spend a lot of time producing anecdotal, in-depth qualitative research. And while this research is very indicative of possible trends and directions, it always remains at the scale of the indicative. And so I had this thirst to go beyond that and produce data. And producing data had for me a very specific appeal, which is that once someone has a data set, then you encourage other people to come and work with you. Then you encourage collaborations that actually don't happen because people have the incentive to come because they can access something they otherwise cannot have. So for me, one of the central pillars of establishing a lab was to start thinking about how we can build databases of knowledge that are shareable, that become the basis for collaborative work. The other thing that guides my thinking in choosing a project is the theory of change that you have, because as designers, as city planners, we are not only studying cities, we want cities to be more inclusive, we at least have the ambition to change them. And so if you want to change cities in contexts that are authoritarian, undemocratic, where science doesn't mean that someone will take the study and go and implement it. And I don't have the illusion that this happens in the US either, but it's worse in other contexts. So you can produce a study and that study will stay on the shelf and no one will look at it. So my theory of change was that I have to find topics where activists are already working. And the knowledge I'm producing becomes also useful to them. So this is knowledge that is very much informed by contemporary questions in urban theory and city planning, questions that I can bring to the table for activists here from my participation in international conferences, from my conversations with colleagues in global urban studies, but that I can then confront with the reality of my context and render useful to local activists. And so a lot of the projects that I've worked on in the last 10 years became very much coming out of that need to build knowledge that can bring collaborations, but that also empowers activists to be able to push further that knowledge. And of course, I mean, I consider myself also someone who's very involved, who's trying to push public policy, but that means working with CBOs, with activist groups, with protest movements, so that we can push things forward. The first project I want to present is really the dearest project to my heart. It's the Beirut Built Environment Database. So this is a database that includes all the buildings that were developed in Beirut in the post-Civil War, georeferenced one by one, with a number of indicators about every one of the buildings in the city. So what you see are the outcome of detailed surveys, and I'll talk a little bit about methods in a minute, but that show you which buildings have solar panels, how big the buildings are, how tall they are, when they were built, who they displaced, how many vacant units does every one of those buildings have, which one has access to water, which doesn't, where are the city mains, and how do they and where are the illegal wells, and how does this affect the quality of water that city dwellers access in different moments of the city. So you look at this, and frankly, I mean, in any city in the United States, this looks like, of course, you can get it from the city authorities. The thing is, we did not have an accurate base map of Beirut when we started. So for 7 to 8 months, I worked with a team of people who were knowledgeable of geographic information systems and could develop a map. But we worked with public agencies. So we worked with the land registry, we worked with the municipality, we collected maps, and we worked with the local National Research Center to give trust to public agencies so they're willing to work with us. And we actually managed to build a first geo-referenced base map of Beirut. So you have the lots, the buildings, and that sort of becomes the base on which you can create new layers that can be shared with other people. We also had just won an election in the local syndicate for engineers and architects. So for the first time, we could get a data set of all the building permits that had been filed in Beirut during the post-Civil War era. And that was 30 years because the Civil War ended in Beirut in 1990. So they had destroyed everything since before 1995. So that's what we got. We got that data set, went to the field, and mapped with a team of 10 every single building, looking for attributes. Among these attributes, we were interested in who is the developer who developed the building, because that is not included, but also was it built or not? How many vacant units does it have? What kind of facade does it design in its relation to the street? What kind of amenities does it produce? Does it rely on solar energy? And all sorts of other social indicators. This allowed us to begin to draw a map of where building development has happened in the city during the period. And so you're seeing there's a lot of care in how we work on the visualization, on this aspect of design, because this is something that has gone to circulate in social media. It has to tell a story. We're building them as videos. And so we really care to explain what is it we're doing and how. Why was this question important? Well, it was because during this period of Beirut, as you can see, there's a very big building boom. These are to the left, the number of building permits that were filed in Beirut, and you're seeing how they are located in the city. And so that was considered as the main emblem of the success of the post-Civil War narrative. Of course, since then, the bubble has busted, and today we are listed by the World Bank as the worst financial crisis in the last 100 years. But at the time we started this research, we wanted to see who was building, where are they building, who's benefiting from this, for who are these homes? and how do they impact the city? And then the question becomes, how do we locate that in a narrative that helps us understand why this building activity is happening? Our research showed first that there was a very high rate of vacancy. And so we wanted to sort of explain the curve. So of course, economists, social scientists will tell you often, especially economists, that real estate markets do this. They go up and down. So you have to imagine that this curve is basically a natural curve. They talk about the cycles of real estate as if it's the cycles of the weather that come every year, or like nature has done that. And in fact, what scholars have increasingly shown is that these cycles actually correspond to active public policy making and decisions by powerful actors that create the booms. And so we wanted to understand what has created the boom. And so we were plotting the number of building permits in relation to incentives given by the National Central Bank for developers to build, facilities given by planning agencies and by in new property rights, in the changes in the building law, in lifting rent control, all of which were allowing this kind of curve to actually happen. We're also interested in where the money was coming when these incentives were given. And there you can see the price of oil booming. And of course, when the price of oil booms, Lebanon is not an oil producing country, but it benefits enormously from the remittances of the oil. So we could show how the remittances were coming and affecting the built environment. And because that's the only period when the balance of payment, which you see here, is positive, you understand that effectively most of the money coming in from the oil boom was actually going into built environment. This is at a time when the housing crisis in Beirut is hitting its peak. So what we could safely conclude is that buildings responded to a financial national policy to keep the currency stable by bringing in capital that was parked in the built environment, while this capital competed with people trying to find homes, and effectively new buildings exacerbated the housing crisis. So you can see how what we're trying to do here is to create a story for why public policy should not stand up to these kind of practices, or why public policy is directly responsible, in fact, during this period for the oil boom. Of course, we also try to show the impacts on the city itself. So with maps like this, you see in yellow the big luxurious apartments, and in blue the smaller newly developed apartments. And there's at least two conclusions that this map is trying to do. One is more segregation. So everyone who has a sea view or is near Beirut downtown is building high-end large apartments, versus in blue the lower income neighborhoods. But also the fact that these buildings are really going everywhere, and the entire city has been turned into a construction site. This also reflects the same idea, this time showing where subsidized public loans have gone and where they have incentivized a building. And again, so this is where you begin to see how collaborations work. Because once we've had the map and we could show this to the director of the public housing agency, he was willing to give us the list of his loans. And so we georeferenced his loans, and then he could see which neighborhoods in the city he had affected and how. And clearly all the high end is here, and there is a segregation that is exacerbated again by where capital is flowing and where it's directing people. Another thing that was very important to us was to advocate against allowing high rates of vacancy, because the laws in Lebanon are very permissive vis-a-vis building vacant buildings. They're actually untaxed. And so what we did is we mapped the number of fully empty apartments. And as you can see, these rates are extremely high. They reach up to 50% around Beirut downtown. They are closer to 15 in the lowest income neighborhoods. So really, this is a city that's been vacated from its residents, where many of the apartments are being used more for as sort of safety deposit boxes than being used as homes. We went on mapping the developers, who they are, and trying to study their connections, their networks. So what this shows here is every developer. We tried to map all the companies where he has shares and what other developers he's actually connected to, or bankers or politicians. So we stalked their Facebook pages to see with who they take pictures with. We looked at their registrations, and we tried to build a map of who works with who and how. And what you find out is that actually building development, especially for the high end, is extremely concentrated. And you have less than 30 developers really taking charge of most of the high-end lucrative building development. While the very high number of developers is actually number of people who closed up other businesses to try and start in real estate because it was seen as lucrative. And this sort of talks about how that affects also how these kinds of policies were affecting the urban economy. I'll skip this just to say, of course, when you think about financialization, you want to think about what happens to the rest of the city. And one of the things that for us was very noticeable is that the city was having an increasing number of older buildings that were looking like this. So you can say, yes, these are people who are leaving these buildings and moving into new buildings, or the more we looked, these are also buildings that are being bought in the anticipation of future financialization. So you don't want to see the boom on its own and the bust on its own, as Professor Martin Murray tells you. You have to see them at the same time. And when you see them at the same time, you see how the city is being taken over by building developments in the anticipation of a future profit. And in the meantime, more and more of the buildings are also rendered uninhabitable for the urban majorities, not only in terms of the new development, but also how these old developments actually are being emptied out of their residents or turned into temporary, very precarious shelter. So this platform, this online platform, which is a way in which we engage people to come and tell their story, collects case studies of buildings that are emptied out. And this we've worked with graduate students, and now increasingly even with undergraduate students. And we help them collect the story of a cluster in the city, produce historical maps, contemporary maps, interview dwellers, look for building permits, look for property titles, recorded transactions, and understand what ends up producing these kinds of urban clusters in the city. And I'll talk in a little bit about this. The third place where we also intervened on housing is through this online platform, which is called City of Tenants. And here what we try to do is to recognize that people are trying to find shelter in the city very much in a context of no information. And so what you want to do is try to help tenants give information to other tenants. If you're looking for a house in this neighborhood, that's kind of what you should expect to pay. Our research, particularly on refugees, showed that when refugees first arrive to Beirut, they pay a very high rent because they don't know. And over the first few months, they're going to sell their jewelry, use all their savings while they're trying to keep a rent. And then by the time they figure out that they're paying way too much, they are already lost most of their savings. And so if you can provide platforms that can allow people to access information on who rents what and how, and this is in English, but of course the base platform is in Arabic, then you can support people in finding shelter. And this is already 1 year since we started this work. These are some of there's more than 2,000 data points on the platform. And what you can see here, for example, which is very telling, is that is how much people pay for rent and how much people pay for services. And because of the devaluation of the Lebanese currency over the last 2 years, the Lebanese currency has lost 97% of its value in the last 2 years. What you see is that services have become incredibly more expensive. And so you see in yellow the services, in blue the rent, and of course it depends on the income and the neighborhood. But people can actually click on any point and find out, in this neighborhood, this is about what I expect to pay and where. Okay, so you challenged me in the questions to tell you also, okay, you produce all this knowledge and how does it eventually get somewhere? So there is one set of the work, which is very much about sending that work in packaged, very simple information in newspapers, on social media, giving it to activist groups, allowing for the story to circulate because that creates awareness. Putting tools like City of Tenants in people's hands that should be easier to use than they are right now, in all frankness, but that can empower people with information is very important. The last point we have been engaged in is to try and bring public sector actors, activists, professional developers, and researchers around the table to talk together about, so how have we managed housing and land in the last years, and how can we do things differently? And so what we did last year, and we're about to start again now, is with the support of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy in Boston, really, and their experiences in South Africa that were incredibly useful. We started a series of exercises with this group of people. One exercise that I really loved that we designed was to give them 30 laws that were passed in the last 30 years and tell them, okay, let's classify every law on how much it supports the social value of land versus the exchange value of land. And so by debating these points and activists yelling at developers, and we get to the point where we show how maybe not always a consensus, but at least some kind of a shared vocabulary about what we call and how. And it also allows us to have a collective vision about, so yes, over the last 50 years, it's very clear that more and more policies have pushed towards the exchange value of land. And that becomes a conclusion that you write, and you then begin to say, okay, so what's the next question? Should we consider which tools and how? And so this is an ongoing effort. It's part of several efforts that we've been doing to try and link public actors with, and really this exercise allows us, in a country where we see the government as incredibly corrupt and not a partner in planning, it allows us to begin to find local heroes in public agencies who are trying to make a difference and to build partnership inside and outside the state. And so that's a very tactical exercise. It's slow with respect to the speed of the financial crisis and the levels of poverty that are raising, but it's also what we can do as researchers, as people engaged in the local context. All right, so I'm going to shift gear now and talk about a whole other thing that's much more design-based, because I wanted to, this is the closest I come to design. And it has to do with the post-blast. I think all of you have seen the pictures of the Beirut port explosion in August 2020. It was considered the largest non-nuclear explosion that was done. About a third of the city's urban fabric was severely destroyed. And the port blast allowed us to test for the first time the idea that if we have a shared database, people will use it. And so we had the base map of Beirut, and what we did for the first 2 weeks is I just went around to engineers who were doing relief surveys, NGOs, government agencies, the Red Cross, and just said, are you collecting data? Please georeference in relation to this same base map. And what this allowed us to do simply within the year after is to create shared databases of information that could allow every NGO to see where the other NGO was working. It could allow the order of engineers to have a unified understanding of where there were structural damages, etc. Our main concern in this post-disaster recovery as planners was that most of the focus was on repairing homes. And while repairing homes is incredibly important for people to come back to their house, the city is much more than the sum of homes. There are shared spaces that need to be recovered collectively for people to have a sense of a we and my neighborhood is doing a little bit better. And now in normal planning circumstances, the agency that would do that, and that's the assumption in all planning theory, is the state. And so you have this idea that there's a state that's the custodian of the common good. And we've seen it in some cases, including in the US, where after Katrina, people felt the government was very responsible for what happened to New Orleans, and they did not want to collaborate. You see it much more extremely here after the Port Blast, where everyone felt that the reason why this explosion happened was for the callous neglect of public officials. And if they could do that, then they did this to us and they killed us, and we don't want them to help. And yet, in this context, who recovers the public? How do we rebuild a sense of a collective in this context? So what we decided to do as a research lab, what I decided to do in the research lab, I should say, because we've done so many different things and my colleagues have really worked on other projects, was to take one project of a big public space and try to bring actors on board around it as a way to recreate a shared narrative about an urban public and a collective sense of recovery around public spaces. The site that we took was, again, I told you, like always go where the activists are, was a site of a highway that had been designed during the 1960s, never implemented. And then during the last 15 years, we had fought as activists to prevent its implementation. Because of course, the highway was designed in the 1960s when city authorities thought that urban mobility had to happen by car and car was king. But by 2020, no one, at least I hope so, designs highways through the city. And what we were trying to do is to say, you can't anymore think of urban mobility through private car ownership. Let's recover this area that was already, we say expropriated here. I think it's a taking in the US. What it means is that the government, that the city authorities had purchased the property actually already to implement the highway, but they never actually implemented the highway. And in the last 10 years, it wasn't implemented because of activists who were just like blocking it, saying you're destroying heritage building, you're displacing people. That doesn't work. And what we suggested is that instead this highway becomes public space, that it becomes a major urban park that would actually give people a sense of a collective and attract back people to the neighborhood that was severely affected by the blast. Now, what this required us to do is an enormous amount of groundwork in which we mapped buildings to understand where was cultural heritage or old buildings in this area and what were grounds in which we could protect, recover, defend these buildings. Who owned them anyway? Where was public land that city authorities had paid for and never actually taken up because they've been squatted, they've been taken over by strongmen locally who are renting them to migrant workers. So we did months of archiving in different public agencies to try and see who has kept what. Remember, there were 15 years of civil war between the moment the city authorities bought this and the moment they came to implement the highway. So a lot of data was lost. We also started talking to local residents to think with them about, so how can we encourage your businesses? How can we recover this neighborhood and attract you back to it so you can work here? And we mapped all the residents and interviewed them to understand their attachment to place, how they would see the design, how would they feel about this becoming a big park where people would come from the rest of the city. We mapped stairs, local passages, so that we can connect this pathway to a wider footprint. And we ended up with connecting that passage with other public spaces in a way that could produce a network of public space at a larger scale than the square. Finally, we produced a first preliminary design of the highway trajectory with the idea that that becomes a way to engage city authorities. And so we've been working very closely with community groups. And so there's different groups you bring on board to produce a project like this. There's first inside the lab. And to me, this is incredibly important because you have to bring on board your colleagues first. Again, there is no city authority that's the big custodian. So you want to bring the planners, the designers, the young people who are active in this field. You want to bring them on board as part of the conversation. You want them to contribute to the design because then they have a sense of ownership and it becomes part of sort of the planning process that that they take. Of course, you also have to take the project back to the street and talk to residents. And I mean, at least in Beirut, you never ever do anything like this before. And that was done in Karantina, so that's for another project. But you never do this before you visit people inside their homes and have one-to-one conversations and understand, because you're competing with political parties, with other actors. What this produced, and then the next phase is the visualization, where visioning exercises like this allow you to engage communities with an aspirational sense. So no, we're not taking over just this building. What we're trying to do is create a project that can fit, that doesn't move your house, but that can actually really upgrade the neighborhood. And so now we're in the process where we're doing some of these visualizations, and we're trying to engage city authorities to be part of the conversation, so that they can, they call on different non-governmental organizations or other implementing parties. Because what you have to realize is that the government is completely bankrupt. So there is no way municipal authorities can actually implement this. The only way we can do it is through either relief money or corporate social responsibility and all these other networks of international donors. So this has to happen in small packages. And while it looks like one big project, the challenge is really to redesign it into smaller packages that come up together through micro projects into a single large-scale urban intervention. And that requires way more coordination. This is the first piece of the project, which is now about to be implemented very proudly. It will be the only piece we will implement as a lab, because we're not an implementing party, but we're doing this just as a first urban disruption in order to show that this is possible and to create facts on the ground. So this is the design where we widen a sidewalk where the highway lands actually in the street, and create a big square. Of course, I did not design any of this. I'm not an urban designer. This is done in collaboration with a private design office who's done it as volunteer work. And that's kind of what this would look like. And through these kinds of drawing, the local store owners, who were first very resistant to the idea of seeing the sidewalk widened and less cars, sort of were brought on board, and that allowed us to take them with us to the municipality and convince authorities that this was doable. And of course, this sort of pushes for thinking how you replicate this beyond slowly so that it expands to the entire city. And so this is supposed to start being implemented next week. And yeah, that's it. So there's a lot more projects at the lab that we've been doing, work to protect the city's coast and rezone it, more post-disaster recovery work, and more analytic work on actors in post-disaster recoveries and how they behave. But I wanted to just present two projects that I feel can provide enough insights about notions of collaboration methods. And maybe I'll stop here and take some of your questions.
Thank you so much, Mona. This was an incredible talk. We're going to transition now to the question and answers. And while we give a bit of time for our colleagues to share comments and questions, we would like to hear your reflections on a couple of things. We would like to get started with an invitation for you to share your thoughts on the question that we are asking all of our guests. What is the urban question that our work should address today with the most sense of urgency?
So if I'm hearing you well, the question you're asking is, what is the urban question that we should address with the most urgency, right?
Yes, good.
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to speak very much from my local context. And I think that the biggest threat to the urban today is the loss of a sense of a collective and the existence of a custody over that collective that is shared and trusted. What do I mean by this? I mean that when our profession started becoming taught about 100 years ago, there was a very strong sense that there was a public custodian that was the state. This was strengthened with modernity. but this was strengthened very much with modernity. In many times, the state was, of course, city authorities did not represent the urban majorities. Of course, there was a lot of problems in the way the projects were designed. Many people were excluded. And the challenge was around this idea of how do we create more inclusion? How do we create more equity? I think today we are qualitatively in a very different position where we have by and large abandoned this idea of equality. We see how city authorities in most cities around the world are playing themselves now the game of collecting more taxes from building activities so that they can attract more projects. So they're gambling with the rest of the developers, while people feel a very strong sense of alienation from their representatives, from anyone who governs the city. And I think that inability to govern the collective creates an enormous challenge that we need to consider. For me, the rest of course, there are a huge other number of challenges, right? In climate, just to think of one. But the fact that we have been unable to create the accountable political structures through which we can govern ourselves as collectives, and that we have abandoned in the process the ideals of equality, creates, I think, the biggest challenge to my mind that has to be addressed. How do we recreate custody over our collectives and a sense of a shared collective that can be governed towards it? Yeah.
That was super helpful. Like right now, equality and like getting everyone involved is extremely important. The next question we wanted to ask was with respect to the things that are happening around the world today. Like the last thing that was devastating was the impact of the earthquake in Turkey and Syria. Your work with respect to that has transmits a sense of urgency for our discipline and professions to act, to build new coalitions and experiment new approaches for a more responsive and grounded practice. In a way, we see the lab is an infrastructure to exercise this approach. So can you tell us a bit more about the way students are involved? How is it impacting curriculum and the scholarship that you're producing?
Yes. So our students are, first, the lab is a research center, and so we do our best to involve the largest number of graduate students in conducting their thesis work, in being involved in research projects, either through workshops or more generally through attending lectures, being part of the work that exists, sort of by sharing, by organizing events, by etc. But we do have a solid number of students who conduct their master's thesis in the lab and who become much more closely involved in our day-to-day work. Of course, when there's a very big crisis in the city, like the Beirut port blast, I mean, one of the most touching things is that your students are actually ahead of you. They're collecting the trash, they're helping people in their homes, and they're trying to make a difference. And if you decide to stay in your office and close the door, they will never respect you. So in a way, I don't feel that we're only involving our students in the urban. They're also like very much part of this. The crisis is their everyday life. They are involved, and we then sort of follow them in a way and try to create opportunities through which we get involved beyond as citizens, also as professionals. And I think that that's sort of what the lab tries to do, to then create opportunities where they can put their design skill at the service of or their planning skill at the service of larger urban questions.
Thank you for that. I would actually invite everyone else who has a question. I'll open the floor to them right now. So moving on to the next question, I would invite Zook to go ahead with the next question.
Hi, Mona.
Hi.
I wanted to ask a couple of questions. So the first one is, in territories in crisis, you invite us to consider the role of micro-planning and micro-interventions as a way of building into the larger integrated vision over time. In our class, we have studied the notion of the temporal urban prototypes and their capacity to be transferred from city to city and be assembled by smaller collectivism. In a time of uncertainty, these approaches promise ways around the notion of planning and design as permanent vision and invite coalition buildings. How important is the temporal nature of these ways of working of our professions beyond crisis? Could these temporal prototypes work as a less developed city, work for a less developed city or extended territory?
If I understand well your question, I think that the question of time is central to our profession, right? I mean, and for a very long time, and I'm saying our profession, I'm thinking of city planners. We thought we could control time, the future. We thought we could influence it so much. And we had so many big ambitions and designs about how we can shape the future in a way. And you can see this in the work of the early urban designers, especially those who came to cities in the South. I'm thinking of Abercrombie in Jerusalem, for example, and Le Corbusier in Chandigarh, etc. like that. I mean, they really redesigned places thinking that we control the future. And I think that if they weren't so powerful ultimately because city dwellers and other forces always took over. I think the other thing that's very important is that we're even way less powerful than these guys were at the time, and that today we are competing particularly with forces of financial capital that are so powerful and so transformative of our urban context that our ability to think at the scale of these macro projects is deeply wounded. And so for me, the micro project is a way of trying to think about the process itself first as a very performative process. So what I mean by this is that I'm putting out an image, and you saw the beautiful images that my colleagues have drawn that I use. They're images of how we imagine cities should be, because they bring people on board. Mm-hmm. And then you translate that into things that are doable, where you show a small win, because there's a very strong sense in Beirut, and you mentioned context where uncertainty is high and less developed. Definitely we are in that context. So we translate that into very small micro projects in the sense that they are doable, and because they're doable, they give a sense of success, and that allows people to come back, and they set in, what we're trying to do is put in place a good process, if you want. The problem with the micro projects is that, I mean, the entire post-disaster recovery in the last 3 years after the port blast has happened at the hands of non-governmental organizations. And the NGOs are very small, they compete over funds. And what this does is it dilutes the interventions into the much bigger and stronger forces of the market. So the only way we could do it is to create that vision of like a huge project, but then translate it into small initiatives and invite them to own and take on different pieces. I don't know if this will be successful, but it's an attempt to recover the grand narrative, if you want, of planning, and in a way put the cart ahead of the horse, in the sense that while planning theory for many years had talked about the fact that you need a common good and you plan in the name of the common good, I'm saying planning make people imagine that there is a common good and work towards it. Perhaps that's how planning can be useful in contexts where there are no trustable authorities, where there are no trustable custody over a collective, if you want. I don't know if that's answering your question. I'm trying to come to it.
No, that does. Thank you so much. I have one more question though. I wanted to ask, your piece tells us about how through the Beirut Urban Lab, you are engaging a city in crisis, both in short-term tactical strategies that keep life functioning, improving, but also maintaining the long-term vision. How do you sustain the partnership over time?
With sleepless nights. I actually explained that one of the, if you remember, like when I said creating a data set, for example, so creating platforms of partnership, places where people feel that they can come back and act on those to get something and come back to that something and eventually contribute your data set to that platform. And in doing that, you begin to own that shared source of data and you begin to want to contribute to it more. When we started building the Beirut Built Environment database, and I really think it's a key element of what brings public agencies to us and what brings NGOs to us. When we started building the city map, no one took it seriously and people rolled their eyes. And when we first went looking for data, we were met with very harsh criticism and resistance, and people don't want to give you data. Now it's the other way around. I have a request from the municipality. Can I give you all my building permits and you digitize them and put them for us there? And so I'm beginning to tell myself, okay, you're a research center. You're not a national planning agency. How do you balance that? But I think that's the thing. Create a stake for people to come back, an incentive to want to collaborate, and that brings them back. And for us, that was what worked, or seems to be working for now. I'm very cautious.
Yeah, definitely.
With declaring success. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much. Moving on to Maria for the next question.
Yeah. Hello, Mona. Thank you so much. That was a very intriguing projects that you discussed, and it was indeed inspiring. And since you discussed about the projects that you initiated as a public park, public open space, I think my question is like it revolves around the same concept, as in how can we think of more or such urban prototypes that are sustainable and are also engaging specific publics which are evolving with context, especially for the cities with crisis, which are also transferable to other contexts as well. So how can we think of similar urban prototypes?
I think the key word here is process. It's not a specific urban form. It's not, it's being able to think through how it worked in a certain place and bring some of the processes. One of the things that got me thinking about the park is shortly after the Beirut port blast, we had a colleague in Colombia who said, I want to help you. What do I do? And I said, if you really want to help me, bring 10 people who are involved directly in planning or design in a post-disaster recovery. And I just want to hear what they did. And the experience that marked me enormously among the experience we heard was Aravena in Chile. And what he described about participation for me was incredibly aspirational. And here's the reason why. It's because when we do participation here, we're often stuck with the fact that the summit of people's imagination is what they've lived, and there's a lot of resistance and people not wanting to work together. So my public space, I don't want you to be in it. In Beirut is a city where 1 in 5 people is a refugee in the last 10 years because of the war in Syria and the fact that the refugees are here, where there's a lot of migrant workers and tensions vis-a-vis their presence in the urban, where still remnants of the civil war and sectarian divides are there. So when you say public space, I want my public and I don't want you in my public. And so creating a we is basically putting people in a place and each one telling the other, I want this, no, I want that. And so what he described is a process in which he asked for 100 days. His team asked for 100 days to come up with a project And he said, we took 30 days and we just listened. We didn't say anything else. We watched, we observed, and we listened. And then we took 10 days to work and we came back. And when we came back, we told people, you can only talk about the proposal. We don't want to hear anything anymore. And it was that idea, observe, understand how you can intervene as a process, and then don't accept anymore to talk in general. Talk about what you want to do as an intervention and get people to tell you why it's good or bad or how it can be different, but only in relation to the project. And that has been very empowering, because when we're going now to public authorities, we're not saying you need a public space strategy for the city. I'm not trying to, I'm saying, I want to do that. You own this property, you haven't recovered it. I want to recover it. Give me the authority to recover it. When we're bringing residents to the table, we're showing them a drawing and they're telling us why they would hate to have people linger on the stairs under their house all night because it would be noisy, but it's around the project. And so I feel there's a lot of this like process-based lessons that are critical that one can learn from. And these are transferable in the sense that you can adapt, change, extend. But I think it's critical to spend time in that place, to be from that place, and to try and intervene from it, learning from elsewhere, in conversation from someone elsewhere.
Yeah. That's true. It's super helpful. Thank you. And I really love the fact that you, that design kept the history that embraces the neighborhood as well, and the way it connected, being everything as it is and still encouraging and empowering. So yeah, it's really beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Mona. So my question will be, how would you suggest urbanists from different parts of the world act to prevent and protect resources from future crises? How can we approach a sort of anticipatory planning approach? And who are the key allies for us to engage in with?
Well, it's a very difficult question, honestly. I mean, I don't think I can answer. I don't think I can give a recipe for that. I can tell you what's worked for me individually. For me individually, it's been very important to have a steady activist voice at a distance from all political parties in the local context. I work in a context that's very, very divided and divisive. And so, and I will not work for any of these actors. So I have to be at an equal distance from them and count the number of times my space from all of them equally. So it's important to have that in order to be able to understand the local context. At the same time, it's very important for me to be learning from and engaged with colleagues in other contexts and reading academic journals on specific issues that matter to me, but being in conversation, understanding how other people are dealing with, reacting with issues, and being able to connect these multiple scales together, this local scale in which I'm engaged, my local collectivity of planners, actors, public sector actors, activists, to create that conversation at my city scale, and then to continue to have a conversation with other researchers in other places. For me, this has been very useful because it keeps me also aware of what is being said elsewhere, what is happening. So I'm not just lost in my context. I don't know if that answers, but that was a super hard question.
Yeah, totally. Thank you so much for answering. It's super helpful and informative. And now I think I'll hand it over to Sonam.
I think Dr. Mona also had a question.
Oh, sorry. I don't know. The students prepared questions. Are you done with your questions? Otherwise, I would love to ask something as well. Okay, I'm just jumping in. First of all, thank you so much. It's super impressive work, and I'm so, I mean, I'm literally blown away that it's not.
Did I freeze or did Mona freeze?
she's the one freezing. So
Well, when you're in Beirut and it's not you, you're always happy.
no, this is and yeah, this is Mona's.
Oh, that
Hello, Mona.
Sorry.
So you will have to repeat a little bit. Yeah.
Yes, sorry. Maria and I are sitting in neighboring offices. Obviously, there's something going on here. So I don't know how much you heard me talking first.
We didn't. If you can please repeat.
Yeah, so first, congratulations to your really amazing and very important work. I'm so impressed by the fact that it's, you know, going through all the scales of the urban agency, starting with data collection in a city that obviously doesn't have a trustworthy planning department, building these projects, working together with a group of, you know, stakeholders, activists, etc., but then also stepping into the realization of these projects. I mean, I find this is a bandwidth of the urban project that is so important. So first, congratulations, that's really amazing. I'm impressed also by the idea of data to generate knowledge and to share this knowledge, and with this action can take place. Here at UVA, we have also a series of NSF grants where we are developing tools that are all about data collection and also sharing data, as well as allowing these tools to be platforms for open source contributions. So my question is, what is your experience? Do you work with open source, which means crowdsourced data that comes from neighbors and participants without your students walking around and collecting them? If you have any experience with this, and then, you know, if this is a good one or a bad one. And then the second one is when it comes to the shift towards a project, you know, here in the US, a lot of neighborhood associations and neighborhoods are actually, they were willed to share data, and then they see that nothing ever happens with the data. So there's a fatigue that neighborhoods actually don't want to participate anymore because of this. So I'm so interested about the joint between data collection research and then also shifting towards the realization of a project.
Okay, on the open source, it is much harder than we thought, but we're trying. So the City of Tenant platform that I showed, the from tenants, so by tenants for tenants, is supposed to be a user-fed database. And so anyone can log in and they can put the information on their apartment, and they have a short survey, or if they are very kind, they take the long researcher survey. I think we have 2,300 data points, of which 2,295 are actually, you knock at the door and you say, please, can you fill it? And then you encourage them, and then you manage to fill it. So I can't claim that we have been successful in getting people on board to do it. We talked about organizing marathons, or like where we bring in activists in different places and create visibility and encourage people to do it. Honestly, a part of the problem is how many terrible things have happened in the last 2 years. So people's mental space is really taken by how much the currency rate has turned today, and what can I buy, and how will I be able to stay in my apartment, and that it's been difficult to put more demand on people. So that has been a major hurdle for us, being able to ask people to fill data. 3 years ago, when we first started, the first version of the built environment database was going to be user-fed and people just inserting 3 or 4 facts. And we had organized the first big activist meeting. There was a lot of buzz, but then the meltdown happened and everything happened. So I think it's a very useful process, but so far, not great success in getting people on board. And if you have tactics or ways, I'd love to learn. For the people being tired from participation. Of course, the neighborhoods that are low income, there's a lot of survey fatigue and people feel overstudied and underserved. Unfortunately, now since the Beirut port blast in August 2020, and the kind of financial devaluation you have, there is a sense that these surveys bring also people who will have money, and there's a lot of NGOs in the neighborhoods, and this has become a business. So I'm seeing less fatigue than before and more, can I get $50 for you or $10 for you filling my survey, and things like that. So people have learned to monetize this, and they're trying to monetize this more than anything else, even for anything. And I mean, the disaster of this NGO economy is that it turns people into specialists of attracting and using aid. I mean, we've interviewed people who have left their jobs because they found out that if they just stay on the street and catch the NGO worker and make sure they get a fridge or a stove once a month that they sell, they will make way more money than what they get from the work that they had. And so the proliferation of non-governmental organizations and the absence of the state has created a situation in which people are being entrepreneurial about the existence of aid and support and pushing in that direction. And so I think that that's the main thing that you see. Otherwise, so for the specific projects that we're doing, that's why I said we try to knock at people's door and get them at a good time and try to show them a project on one-to-one rather than expect them to come to one big community meeting. And we try to organize the big meetings because the shared thinking is important, but we have much more success in one-to-one discussion than we do in collective thinking, in collective participation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions? Otherwise, I think students are also starting to get back into class at 1 o'clock. I think we can wrap it maybe up. Maria, if you have a couple of comments. I mean, I so much appreciate your work and that you took your time to present this today. I also heard the importance to be from a place in order to be really productive in the urban setting. I hope that in the future, maybe there are potentials for collaborations if you ever invite universities to join your effort. I know Maria and I would be super excited to be a part of this.
Thank you. This is very kind. We'd love to. We'll think about ways of making this happen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mona, thank you so much. Very little to add. Deeply inspired by the work. Already having the website is incredibly. I don't want to say productive. It's incredibly inspiring for many of the students that are finding ways of understanding why mapping matters, and why when we are working on these particular techniques. There are always opportunities to activate, to be critical, to actually take on this opportunity of studying, and to situate the conversation from scratch and do something that I feel like in many design schools we struggle with, this notion that we are problem solvers, but sometimes we are working on problems that are poorly defined, right? So there is something in the way in which the lab is working, being incredibly careful in defining what are the specific questions that you are posing, and then showing us a way of, selecting the methods, selecting the approaches. And I feel like that's perhaps, resonating deeply with the students, because they actually see how, how thoroughly you are actually following on that process. I want to say also that it's much appreciated that the projects are not only looking at being actionable and having an impact, in the way in which you are also situating them. I cannot tell you how much students that are crafting their thesis proposals right now are also, looking at that way of situating a project in space and time and disciplinarily. So because we don't know if you are actually getting all the hits that, we are doing into the website, just for you to know that the work that you do is really, really changing the way in which we are considering, how to work and how to situate ourselves. So thank you so much for the opportunity to have you joining us today, and in a way bringing a face and, bringing an energy into what is already a, work and incredible fascinating approach to, to urban theory and practice and planning and design and you name it, right? Because sometimes those divisions are not helping us to move things forward. So on behalf of all the two groups, thank you so much.
Thank you really for all the kind words. I'm absolutely humbled, and I am really grateful for your attention and for the great questions and comments, and hopefully there'll be other opportunities to all work together. And feel free to reach out, guys, if you have questions about a specific project or something. We're happy to answer, huh?
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.